We are at lecture 5.3 in our Apologetics course here, and today we're going to look at chapters 3 and 4 of the Van Til book, Defense of the Faith. We've looked at the first two chapters, and it's really here that we kind of get into the some of the complexity of Van Til's way of thinking and some of his neologisms, that term that simply means borrowing a word or using a word in a new sort of kind of way. And so he's going to talk about knowledge or epistemology in chapter 3. Then in chapter 4 he's going to deal with Christian ethics. So let's just kind of jump into this. Now let me just say one thing about the Van Til reading that I've alluded to already but have not said directly, and want to help you a little bit with this. Some of you might breeze through this. When I first read this book 30 years ago, I really struggled with it. And even in rereading it again just recently, there are elements of it that are a challenge, there's no doubt. And part of it gets back to something I mentioned in the previous lecture, and that is that Van Til did not have a large dialogue group with whom to discuss these views so that he could write with clarity. Oftentimes his writings were not well reviewed. By not well reviewed, I mean not many reviewers. So whereas many theologians today can read reviews of their writings and evaluate whether or not a review has merit, and then next time around or in the second edition do something about that, Van Til didn't have much of that. People pretty much did not pay close enough attention to review his writings that much because he was an outsider in many ways. At least until in the last 15 or so years of his professional career, probably from about 1955 on. And again, he retired in 72. From 55 on, he was able to attract a lot more attention from people that we would look at and say, well, these are significant figures. E.J. Carnell, Carl F.H. Henry, Bernard Ram, people like that. So, spent a lot of years sort of wandering in his own minefield in some ways. And I don't mean to make it sound too bad, but he's hard to read. There's just no doubt about that. So why pick this book? Because sometimes you have to read something that's hard to read. And I hate to tell you that. But it's true. And so I'm trying to work towards your sanctification here, both spiritual and intellectual, and have you read some things where when you read a few pages, you look back and you say, I'm not quite sure what he just said. That's an important part of education. And so I'm not just blathering here and trying to give you some excuse and as if to say, well, I didn't realize how bad this was going to be or how difficult this was going to be. No, I knew how difficult it was going to be. But you need something like this to stretch you at times. And believe me, when I got stretched by Van Til 30 and 35 years ago, it was a help to me in the long run. Maybe not immediately. So you may burn the book at the end of the semester, or you may throw it against the wall or something else. But I think that we'll benefit from having read some things not quite as clearly written as C.S. Lewis or as Os Guinness. All right, now you have to understand that for Van Til, he's operating out of this understanding that metaphysics, that is, the evaluation of those things that are really real, the reality of God, the reality of human nature, and the reality of all other things, and epistemology are tied closely together. And so you can't simply work from one to the other. You have to assume them both at the same time. And so even though we're working more at the level of epistemology, knowing, we have to recognize that the God whom we are attempting to know is the God whom the Bible says he is. Of course, Van Til is an unabashed Calvinist. He makes no bones about that. He has a whole book out that he wrote many years ago called The Case for Calvinism. It was a contrast over against three other books that had been commissioned, The Case for Liberalism, The Case for Neo-Orthodoxy, and The Case for Orthodoxy. And he wrote a book. He was not part of the team, decided to write his own book, and his was The Case for Calvinism. That comes out over and over again. So we know that about him, and he wants to make it clear. So, for instance, if you were to look at page 33, he's essentially saying that epistemology and ontology, which is just another word for metaphysics, are inseparable. You can't start with one and work to the other. You have to work them both together at the same time. So we assume that the biblical teaching about God is true, and we assume the Bible is true. And that's where we have to start for Van Til. It's not a matter of getting there at the end of the game, as has been for some of the apologetics works that we've read. He spends some time focusing in on Eve and what she knew to be true and what she knew about God, and how ultimately she was lured away. She was seduced away from that by a lesser being. And he is using this as a kind of a paradigm for how modern philosophy has gone. Modern philosophy, modern philosophers, and even ancient philosophers like Plato, deep inside knew some things that were true about God, but they suppressed those in the interest of trying to sort of work out their own epistemology. And he says that's simply wrong. What does God know of himself? He says that God's being is absolute, and his consciousness is absolute as well, and it's not subject to a series of moments in time. This is even a bigger debate today than it was in Van Til's day as to whether or not God experiences time in the way that we do. Does he experience it as a succession of moments? And Van Til is going to say, absolutely not. God stands as the eternal being outside of time. This is a specifically Augustinian interpretation. And Van Til, of course, stands in that Augustine Calvin tradition. And so for him, even to assert that God experiences life as a series of moments is essentially to affirm pantheism. And so this is another thing that we get to with Van Til. Sometimes he will move from one statement to a conclusion without necessarily developing all the steps along the way. So when you read in this chapter about his understanding of God's experience of time, and then the conclusion that anything less than an Augustinian understanding is a reversion to pantheism, you kind of wish that he'd spent a couple of more pages getting us there. But if you think about it for a while, you can understand why he said that. That's another reason why I wanted us to read this book, to read somebody who doesn't always take all of the necessary steps along the way to show us how he comes to the conclusion, just to read a few paragraphs and stop and think about it. It talks about our knowledge of God, and he's going to say that our knowledge of God obviously is subordinate to God's knowledge, especially now because we are sinful beings. He also talks about the fact that our knowledge of God is analogical. And this is something we haven't really dealt with yet. But when we think about how we understand God, there are three possibilities open to us. And this kind of wanders afield from him here. But we might say that our knowledge of God is univocal. That is, that we know everything that is true about God. We can discern those things that are true about God, who God is and what he is like. Well, Van Til doesn't like that because he thinks that God, at certain levels, is a being that we don't really understand. Or we could say that our knowledge of God is opaque. That is, we don't know anything about him. But in between the idea of sort of a clear piece of glass through which you would see everything perfectly, and a painted over piece of glass in which you can see nothing, opaque, he wants to say that the knowledge of God is analogical. We might think of a piece of translucent glass that is, you can see through it, but it's colored and you don't get all of the nuances quite right. That's I think, his way of helping us understand our knowledge of God. God is not fully comprehensible to us, but he is knowable by us. And then he deals with sin. And then at the end of this chapter has a nice little discussion. And then we're going to move quickly on to the fourth chapter to point out how we have three different types of consciousness of God and truth in humanity. And the first was the Adamic. Before the fall, Adam knew things truly. He was receptive to God's revelation. He was obedient to God. Secondly, man under sin. And there, people build on non-theistic assumptions, or they deify parts of this world, and therefore they come up with the wrong conclusions. And then what he calls the regenerate consciousness, which is on its way back. It's a restoration project, and that's where we are. My wife is upstairs right now watching HGTV, and I pray God's blessing on her while she watches that. But this is part of my way not to have to watch that. Not really. But it's a restoration project. That's who we are. We're restoration projects. Then in chapter 4, he talks about ethics. And he wants to do the same thing with ethics that he's done with epistemology, and that is to say, we assume that God is always right when it comes to what he says about what is right and wrong. God made us in his image, and that image did not imply full knowledge of everything, but it did imply an initial perfection when it came to ethical issues on the part of human beings. But of course we fell, sin and the curse, and he gets back to those three elements that he mentioned at the end of chapter 3, and then the regenerated conscience or consciousness, where we're now in that restoration project. He brings out two of his sort of debate partners here in this chapter as well, one of which is Roman Catholicism, and one of which is what we might call, he doesn't use this term, but generic evangelicalism, or sort of Arminianizing evangelicalism. He says back in the very early pages of the book that his targets are Roman Catholicism, modernistic thought that came from Schleiermacher, and an Arminian type of theology. And I think that's what he's aiming at with evangelicalism, although he targets Lewis. And we kind of say, wait a minute, that's our buddy. Don't target Lewis too much. The kingdom of God is the highest good, the summum bonum, the highest good. And he sort of ends the chapter with that, and says that we must appeal to the biblical summum bonum, of which he breaks down into 4 parts. The absolute ideal is maintained. God expects us to live in the way he's told us to live. Number 2, a sinner cannot take the first step in the direction of the kingdom. Number 3, the biblical summum bonum requires the destruction of sin. And then 4, that there is an ethics of hope, that eschatologically this will be realized. So have fun. We'll come back next week and deal with the McDowell book, but also maintain our focus on Van Til.